Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I am here to tell you about how I bought way too many books again. Though I realize there technically is no such thing. I was very lucky this month to get to go out and about and do some wonderful things with some wonderful people, and in that process we acquired some books, which is why I love these people. So I'm here to tell you about them today because I'm very excited to read them in the coming year. First of all, last month I was able to go to a library book sale with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and it was lovely to get to see and hang out with her again, and we both picked up some really lovely books. The first book that I picked up was How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents by Julia Alvarez. Again, as a Spanish teacher, I feel like this is a book that I should have read about the Latino American experience, but I haven't. And this is a beautiful edition that I have never seen before. And from what I can tell, it is about the four Garcia sisters who move from the Dominican Republic to New York in 1960 because of the governmental upheaval that was happening at the time. Here again, failure of the American education system. I did not know that that happened. And thus, in this move, they find themselves caught between holding on to those Dominican traditions and trying to assimilate into New York culture. It sounds wonderful. It sounds really important now and for all time, really. So I'm very much looking forward to reading that at some point. Next, Marissa pressed into my hands this lovely copy of Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. I loved reading Bellman and Black last year, and I technically have read The 13th Tale, although I read it half my life ago now. So I don't really remember it, but it is here on my TBR stack to read. And I know she highly recommends this book as well. From what I've heard other people say about it, it is about an old man who walks into a pub one night with this young girl who appears dead. But she is revived, and from there various short stories are told that are magically real and that somehow interweave with one another. And it sounds really wonderful, so I'd love to read this. Marissa also gave a glowing review to this middle grade book, which I had never heard of, but it was one of her favorites when she was 10, and that is The Ear, the Eye, and the Arm by Nancy Farmer. And this is a futuristic tale set in Zimbabwe in 2194, when General Matsika's 3 children sneak out of the house to go on to an adventure and then disappear. And it is the story of how they are kidnapped, why they are kidnapped, and how they eventually escape. And this sounds really cool and really amazing, but I had never heard of this when I was a child. So I'm intrigued to read it now. I also found this beautiful Everyman's edition of A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland by Samuel Johnson and his friend Boswell. And presumably Boswell is the one writing this all down, about their travels through the Western Islands of Scotland sometime in the 1800s. I love Scotland. I'm very proud of my Scottish heritage, and I love the 18th century, so I'm really intrigued to see what Johnson and Boswell found when they traveled through these islands. And then for purely aesthetic reasons, I picked up this copy of The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. I did find a copy of this at my library's book sale in July, but it was a mass market paperback, which means it was much smaller, the print was much smaller, and quite honestly, I just didn't like the edition that much. But this is a much prettier edition. So again, I can't wait to read this. I know almost nothing about the plot, but I know that it talks about the Chinese American experience and that it has been very highly praised for decades now. So I can't wait to read my first Amy Tan. I then found this play by Tom Stoppard, which is The Invention of Love, which I had never heard of. but it gets better. It seems to be very surreal, almost Christmas Carol-like. Honestly, I just have to read you the back because I don't think I would do a good job explaining it. It is 1936, and A.E. Houseman is being ferried across the river Styx, glad to be dead at last. His memories are dramatically alive. The river that flows through this play connects Hades with the Oxford of Houseman's youth. High Victorian morality is under siege from the aesthetic movement, and an Irish student called Wilde is preparing to burst onto the London scene. On his journey, the scholar and the poet who is now the elder Houseman confronts his younger self and the memories of the man he loved his entire life, Moses Jackson, a handsome athlete who could not return his feelings. As if a dream, this play inhabits Houseman's imagination, illuminating both the pain of hopeless love and passion displaced into poetry and the study of classical texts. The author of A Shropshire Lad lived in the shadow of the flamboyant Oscar Wilde, and died old and venerated, but whose passion was truly the fatal one. That sounds really amazing, and I hadn't even heard of A.E. Houseman until Katie from Books and Things posted her Victober wrap-up, where I believe she read A Shropshire Lad. So I may have to read that before I read this play for it to make any sort of sense, but it sounds really, really cool. I then found this copy of The Sea Hawk by Raphael Sabatini, which I didn't even know was a book, but some of you may know it as the 1930s film starring Errol Flynn. It was one of his big pirate roles. And I love Errol Flynn, and I quite like his pirate movies, though they are a bit cheesy. So I'm really intrigued to read the novel, and then maybe do a novel and film comparison. Let me know if you would be interested in that. I then found this edition of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, which I've been wanting to read for ages. And these are not my favorite editions, but in this case they are an advantage because it's still a monster, but it doesn't feel as huge as other editions might, so it might not feel quite as overwhelming to tackle. I believe I read this or tried to when I was in high school, but I honestly don't remember the plot. So I would be really pleased to try it again as an adult, as it is one of the quintessential classics. I also picked up another Anthony Trollope novel, and that is The Way We Live Now. I know very little about this one except that it has a lot to do with both politics and finance and how those affected society at large, certainly high society. And it is yet another monster, but I would love to read it one day. I would also like to see the BBC adaptation with Matthew McFadden and possibly Cillian Murphy? If it's not Cillian Murphy, it's someone who looks a lot like him. I then found a copy of People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks, which comes highly recommended by both Marissa and my mother, and our former minister Rachel. And it is the story of a very rare Haggadah, the Sarajevo Haggadah. For those of you who don't know, a Haggadah is a sacred text used during the Passover Seder, and how it travels through the generations and how it affected various people along the way. And it sounds wonderful. So I can't wait to get to read that, hopefully in April around both Passover and Easter, since they overlap this year. I also found my own copy of The Mother Tongue, English and How It Got That Way by Bill Bryson, which is exactly what it says. It's the story of the English language and how it developed. I love Bill Bryson as a writer, and in fact my parents own a copy of this that I could borrow, but I've been saying that I was going to read their copy for, 8 or 9 years now, and I still haven't. So I'm hoping that owning my own copy might force me to read it a little sooner. And the last book that I found at that book sale is a children's book, and that is Nona, Tell Me a Story by Lydia Bastianich. Lydia Bastianich is a wonderful television chef focusing on Italian food. And so this is a children's book that she wrote for her grandchildren and was then published. It's a really beautiful story. We bought it for some of my younger cousins for Christmas a year or two ago now. And I was especially pleased to find it because it's signed. So this will definitely be read and going into our Christmas book basket very, very soon. Then I received a couple of books as gifts since it was my birthday last month and people very kindly gave me books. The first two come up from my dear friend Amanda, and they are Bringing Down the Duke and A Rogue of One's Own by Evie Dunmore. I have heard lovely things about these two books. They are feminist Victorian romance novels, all buzzwords that I love. And the fact that Amanda has read and loved them and wants to share them with me makes them extra special, and I'm very pleased to read them at some point. Also, not a birthday present, but as some of you may remember, I am giving my friend Jonathan, who has appeared on this channel before, Spanish lessons. And I said instead of payment, since we've known each other for so long, he could pay me in books. So my first payment has shown up in the form of Lore Olympus Volume 1 by Rachel Smythe. This is a webtoon series that I started following this year and fell in love with. And it is a retelling of the Hades and Persephone myth, along with many other Greek myths mixed in there. I love the art style, I love the characterization, I love how many modern topics it is able to tackle through these myths. And there are many more comics published online, but they are starting to be published in physical form. So I'm very grateful to have this edition to add to my collection. And then Marissa very kindly purchased for me the next two books in the Barchester Chronicles series by Anthony Trollope, which are Barchester Towers and Dr. Thorne. And I am very grateful to her for these two. Unfortunately, they hadn't arrived by the time I visited her, so I don't have any physical copies to show you, but I know they will be beautiful and wonderful when we see each other again. Now for the books that I picked up myself. While I was in New York, I picked up 3 books, which are still de-germifying in my basement. I feel like New York is extra germy these days, so I'm letting them sit for a good long while before I bring them upstairs. But the first is Being Wagner by Simon Callow, which is, I'm not sure if it's a pure biography, but it is certainly a study of Wagner in terms of both his music and his life in general. And I'm not a huge Wagner fan per se, but I am a very big fan of Simon Callow. Simon Callow is primarily an actor, and you may have seen him in tons and tons of films and television shows, including the Phantom of the Opera film and Shakespeare in Love, among others. I respect Wagner as a composer because he was a musical genius. He created his own instrument in order to include sounds in his music that could not be created on any existing instruments. That is pretty cool. He was composing works on the scale of, say, Lord of the Rings, in a time when the technology to produce fantasy epics like that just did not exist. But the music still pulls you in like that, and that I think is incredible. However, and the book acknowledges this, he was also a terrible human being. He was extremely racist, extremely self-centered and egotistical, and would have been horrible to be anywhere near. So I'm very intrigued to see how Simon Callow balances those two aspects of Wagner's personality. I also picked up The Secret Adversary by Agatha Christie, which is another recommendation from Marissa. She loves the Tommy and Tuppence series, and honestly, I'm intrigued to read it for 2 reasons. Number 1, no one knows about the Tommy and Tuppence series. Seemingly, no one talks about them nearly as much as, say, Miss Marple or Poirot. Plus, I have never actually read any Agatha Christie books at all. I have seen many television adaptations of her work, but I haven't actually read one of her novels before, so I'm very excited to finally read one. And lastly, in a used bookstore, I picked up a copy of The American Senator by Anthony Trollope. I'm on a big Anthony Trollope kick. I'm hoping 2022 is the year of Trollope. And honestly, I know very little about this plot, except that it clearly centers on an American diplomat who is living in London for one reason or another. And hopefully it's Trollope making fun of Victorian Americans. I would very much like to find out what that is like. Also, my school library is continuing to weed their collection, so I'm always stopping by to see what my coworker is giving away. And I found a couple of books that I would like to take home. Firstly, I found a copy of Out of Africa by Isak Dinesen, which I know is one of my mother's favorite books. And again, she has a copy, but it's a copy with the film cover with Robert Redford on it, which honestly is one of the big draws for my mother. And it's quite fragile by this point, so I don't want to read that copy and run the risk of it falling to pieces and Robert Redford being ruined. So I now have my own hardcover edition, which will be much hardier and hopefully leave my mother's copy in peace. All that I know about this is that it is the true story of Isak Dinesen's time in Africa, I believe in Kenya, where her husband decided to become a farmer. However, she was very unhappily married, and she starts up an affair with a neighboring farmer. Of course, the film starring Meryl Streep and Robert Redford won many, many awards, so I'm intrigued to read the book, as I haven't read it or seen the film. She was also giving away a copy of A Man for All Seasons, a play by Robert Bolt about Sir Thomas More and his time under Henry VIII. This is another of my mother's favorite films, so I am very excited to finally read it for myself, since I also love Tudor history. And lastly, there's a book that is a bit of a spanner in the works, and that is Edward III by, apparently, Shakespeare. Edward III has never been on any published list that I have seen of Shakespeare's plays. And I think that is because he collaborated on this play with so many other people that a lot of scholars have debated how much he was actually involved in the writing of it, and therefore should it be counted as one of his plays. Clearly, Cambridge thought he was involved enough that it could count, that they published it in their Shakespeare collection. Now, as a lot of you know, I have been trying to finish reading all of Shakespeare's plays by the end of this year, and I have one official one to go. This one throws kind of a spanner into the works, therefore, but I am hoping to read it in January, and then definitely have read all of Shakespeare's plays, however you count this one. It is, of course, another history about King Edward III, who may have been the Black Prince. I think he was the Black Prince, and therefore has very interesting implications for the War of the Roses cycle, I believe. Last month, I also hauled 2 more ex-school library copies in the Horatio Hornblower series that I was very excited about, and I continue to be. But they were books 1 and 3 in the series. So I tracked down a matching copy of book 2, of which the dust jacket is falling to pieces, but I'm still excited to have my hands on a copy. And our school librarian very kindly gave me a roll of library book plastic wrap. So hopefully I can wrap up this cover and preserve it so that I can read it safely. And lastly, 2 books that were actually purchases for myself are number 1, Harriet Wilsons' Memoirs, edited and introduced by Leslie Blanch. And Harriet Wilson was apparently the greatest courtesan of the Regency period and the era just before then. which I found out when Marissa and I watched the online streaming event of Being Mr. Wickham, in which Adrian Lucas reprised his role as Mr. Wickham from the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, but looking at him as Wickham is now 60 years old and living in the Victorian period, and looking back on his life and recounting these adventures that he may or may not have had. But he mentions meeting Harriet Wilson, and it was this paramount moment, and she turned him down for Byron. And so Marissa and I looked at each other going, so she was clearly a very important person. How have I never heard of her? So I tracked down this edition of her memoirs to find out more about her. So I may read it soon, I may save it for Jane Austen July. I haven't decided yet. And finally, thanks to the recommendations of the fabulous booktuber This Is Not a Booktube, I found the book Barry Squire's Full Tilt by Heather Smith. And this appealed to me for many reasons. Number one, it sounds hilarious. Number two, it's a light and easy YA book, which I could use occasionally. Number three, it features Irish dancing. And I was an Irish dancer. Riverdance was a huge influence on me as a child. So I am thrilled whenever I see it in any other pop culture. Plus, the author and I share a name. So part of me starts to wonder, did I write this in a parallel universe or in a past life? Or do I have amnesia and I don't remember publishing this? Either way, I am very excited to read it. So there are all of the books that I acquired this month. Let me know down below if you heartily recommend any, if you have any other questions about them, or if you found any books this month that you are equally excited to read. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.